Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Prochazka. Apparently, the AI feature is creating quite an interesting exposure to my head. Makes it look like maybe I've injured myself. I have not, I can assure you. But I don't know what to do about that. Sorry. It's just going to look a little odd. But my name is Ben Prochazka. I'm excited to be here. This is the third in our quarterly series that we are doing with Cox. And I'm excited to say that we've added a new person to the webinar to talk a little bit more about what is happening in the EV market, why there are reasons for optimism, why there are still questions, and what does it all mean? And I think last time, the very first time, it was like sort of the first reaction to the end of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. And it was really important to understand the impact of that and what kind of effect that might be having on the market. And we talked a lot about the idea of maybe demand being pulled forward and that was going to show up later, where we'd see a dip. And then I think, the next one, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what the future holds in the forecast for 2026 and, whether or not that was going to hold steady relative to a year-over-year change from 2025 into 2026. And so I'm excited to have this be the first of the year and to be able to look back and go, okay, what has happened so far for 2026? Where do we see the trends taking place? And so as a starting point and maybe to bring in the rest of the team, and so I'm excited to have Stephanie join us and then Loren McDonald. But one of the, I think, very interesting parts that's happening right now is last time we chatted, Stephanie, we didn't have the context of the conflict in Iran and, gas prices going up 34% over the last couple of months. And the, obvious impact that has. We have 5 to 6 states where gas prices are over $5 a gallon. Most of the forecasts right now suggest that maybe there's no clear end in sight as to when we might see gas prices go down. And there was an interesting little tidbit that I read, which is on Edmunds, that the interest in EVs, not surprisingly, but is going up. And I think, it's yet another opportunity. Last time was the Ukraine war, where that was the conflict that was happening, but where it's really starting to demonstrate, unfortunately, that when we are on oil, and oil is our main primary fuel for transportation, that it can be a big roller coaster, and that that affects consumers, it affects businesses. Whereas if you're plugging in, it really has the chance to remove people and consumers, businesses, etc., from the volatility of oil markets that can be manipulated by bad actors, but also the idea that we control electricity prices and we have the ability to control electricity here, and how we produce electricity is very diverse. So for both Stephanie and Loren, maybe if you could talk a little bit about, sort of how you think that's showing up and what do you think that means for the EV market. And if you wouldn't mind, just introducing yourself briefly, but having that be maybe a kickoff for the question. So I'm excited to have Loren and Stephanie here. And so maybe, Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind starting and introducing yourself and reacting to that, and then we'll go to Loren.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Stephanie Valdez, Streaty, Cox Automotive. I'm Director of Industry Insights, and I just track everything electrification. So I think your question regarding the gas prices, it definitely doesn't translate to sales immediately, right? But it definitely translates into consideration. And we've actually seen an uptick in shopping activity on our Auto Trader Kelley Blue Book sites. So not like not like compared to like 2022, but definitely it's uptick. So for new, it's about 16% compared to March compared to Q4. And then on the used, it was at 30%. So we're definitely seeing an uptick in consideration. But I also want to say that I just think with the uncertainty, right? When gas prices go up, consumer sentiment goes down, that leads to consumer spending going down. And so for a big ticket item like a car, I think consumers are just going to hold off buying unless they absolutely need to. But those that need to, I think an EV, a used EV, is a great option. And so definitely, I think for those people in the market, we're going to see that consideration go up.
So, Loren, welcome. You're
Yeah,
a
thank you.
first timer, a new person to this quarterly. We hope that you can be a mainstay as well. But yeah, maybe if you could share a
Yeah,
little bit about your background and then what you think.
yeah. First, thanks for having me, and I hope that after today I'm invited back on future ones. But Loren McDonald, CEO and Chief Analyst at Chargeonomics, and similar to Stephanie, I track basically all things EV and EV charging. So analysis, everything from tracking model features to the forecasts to everything that's going on in the charging industry. As far as the impact of rising gas prices, I mean, agree with everything that Stephanie said, and would add a couple of things. One is that I especially agree with her on the used EVs, because if you think about just what she said, is that not only is there going to be some increase in consideration of EVs and especially hybrids. Hybrids are probably what's going to really win here over full BEVs. But with the rising prices of everything and consumers less likely to spend, a lot of those people that have, two or three cars, households in the suburbs and stuff might go, we've been thinking about getting an EV, still don't want to spend 50, 60, $80,000 on a Lucid or whatever it is, right? But maybe we'll spend 25 or 30,000 on a 3-year-old Tesla Model Y or something like that, and we'll use it as a commuter car or whatever it is, right? So I think a lot of the people, it might just sort of push them over, and especially with used, because and I know Ben will probably get into this more later, but there's some sweetheart deals out there with used cars. Like you can basically get a new EV for 50%, 60% of what it cost 3 years ago and stuff. So yeah. I would just add, as I made a joke sort of about Lucid, and I think the other thing that I would say is that I think it's the rising gas prices are going to affect different models differently, right? Like, people that are going to buy a Lucid or a Rivian or something like that are going to buy it regardless of gas prices, right? Where it's going to impact is maybe on things like the Chevrolet Bolt, the new Toyota CHR, the Nissan Leaf, the Chevrolet Equinox, and stuff like that. Those that are under 40 in the sort of $30,000-$35,000 range. I think it'll help those, probably maybe move those up a little bit, but it's not going to probably move more Mercedes and Lucids and things like that.
I'm trying my white back screen to see if that gets rid of my what looked like maybe a head wound that I was experiencing. It's a little better, but all right, thank you. That's an interesting start. Maybe to back up for a second. So one of the things and the reason that we started this is that Stephanie, as you introduced, Cox does this sort of analysis, and you're really paying attention to the EV market, and so you all just did your quarterly, and you're about to release the EV portion, but you've already done a little bit of it. And so can you maybe share a few things that jumped out this quarter that you think were interesting or potentially surprising about the EV market?
Yeah, I think we're going to release our report either tomorrow or Friday, and it's probably going to be around 215,000, actually up from what we had forecasted in our call. And I think the big story, and Lauren will probably agree with this, is Toyota. Like,
Yeah.
the BZ is number 3 at the end of Q3 or Q1, number 3, and Lexus is doing well. And Toyota has that halo effect, and they also have some new models launching. Subaru has a couple. So that's what I'm really excited to see, kind of what these new models do. The R2 from Rivian. So I think that's going to be something to watch. And then, I think most of the makes had an increase in sales in March, but when you look at the full quarter, there were only like a handful of makes that actually had year-over-year growth, and that was like Toyota, Rivian, Cadillac, and Lexus. And so the others were, down. So I think it's going kind of what Lauren was saying, those more luxury brands, those consumers that like those vehicles are going to buy them regardless of what's going on in the geopolitical or economic realm. And so that was, I mean, like, I kind of expected that. Tesla still dominates. Their share went back up a bit, about 50% at the end of Q1. The Model Y did really well. The Model 3 declined. But I think that's what's to watch, these new models that'll be launching, to see kind of how they resonate with consumers.
And Loren, you obviously track this very closely as well. And for anybody who's interested and you want to see Loren's take on the EV market, he puts a lot on LinkedIn, and I think it's a great resource. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that I've connected with Loren. But what are things that maybe jumped out for you also? Anything to add to what Stephanie shared about Toyota, et cetera?
It's interesting because I also do a sales estimate for the quarter and stuff. And like 3 weeks ago, I had it at 215. And then last week I brought it down to 210. But regardless, Stephanie and Cox and I are like, within a few thousand of each other. But I thought it was interesting that you just said you're bringing yours up and I brought mine down. But there's still about half a dozen of automakers, all the German ones, Audi and Volvo, right, have not released their numbers yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But and again, I don't want to keep saying I agree with Stephanie, but I do obviously on Toyota and Cadillac and Lexus and things like that. One of the interesting things for me, Ben and Stephanie, was there's about 20 models, BEV models, where the automakers report monthly sales. Most everybody has moved to quarterly or not at all. The models that data is available, almost every one of them has increased month over month this quarter, right? So we're seeing monthly sales increase, but to Stephanie's point, what's holding the overall numbers back is, we're losing a lot of models, right? There's about 10 models that have been canceled, from Ford and Honda and stuff. And so we're actually, losing models being canceled. And then some of the other models like the Equinox and stuff, where they did okay, they were a few quarters ago. So we really need to see some of the high volume models have a good quarter next in Q2.
And Loren, you may have to, we'll have to figure it out. Your feed was a little choppy here and there, but I think we got most of it. So we'll let you know. And if we need to figure out adjusting or turning off your feed for a minute and turning it back on. But
yeah, I might need to turn off my camera. Let me know if it's that's unfortunate, but yeah, I might have to.
Okay, it's fine for now, but just wanted to flag it. So, okay, a couple things. I mean, one trend is an interesting one, which is, and I'm just going to take Stephanie's because I want to offer a little bit of the sense of optimism, but is that things trended a little higher than what you all were initially forecasting. Stephanie, when you look at something like that, and as you all, Cox has done this for a while, does something, one quarter trending a little higher than what you thought it would be, does that affect then how you all potentially forecast the rest of the year? So maybe that's my first question. Then I have a few others based on what Loren you brought up too.
Yeah, I think it's looking at definitely looking like year over year, that those trends, but also like what products are being launched, what's going on in terms of regulation. So it's kind of a bunch of different things that we look at. But the one thing I will say about forecasting in the EV space, it's so hard because you compare, if you compare Q1 last year, the tariffs were announced, right? Yeah. Or when we go looking a couple of years ahead, you're going to look back at Q3 in 2025, and that was the pull ahead, right? So I think it's really can be complicated sometimes, but definitely I think just tracking what models are being launched and kind of the pace they've been doing the prior couple of months, maybe, and then seasonality, you take that into place as well. But I think just looking back at last year and where we're at, I think it's just, this is a year of recalibration. Yeah. It's not a push, no more EVs. It's not like pushing them away. It's just going to take some time to really figure out what that natural demand is. And alongside all these other headwinds, geopolitical and other stuff, insurance rates have gone up significantly. So I just think the affordability in general is a challenge, whether it's an ICE or EV.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, that's true for the car market writ large. I do think that it is going to, and we brought this up as the opening question, this idea of, this higher gas prices and the likelihood that they're going to stay higher for quite some time what does that actually mean for consumers and how quickly do they potentially shift? And obviously, yes, used, that's one option. The lease is still a very attractive way for people to maybe not make a long-term commitment to an EV, but to experience all the benefits, take advantage of the fact that they can not be on this roller coaster that is the oil markets affected by what's going on. But I also, yeah, this used part. So Loren, I'm going to ask you the same question if I could, though. Now that you talked about yours was a little higher and maybe revised down slightly, but what does it do for you at this point after seeing the first quarter? Are there things you react to and think about when it comes to what the future looks like for 2026?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One of the things that I think that's really interesting is that there's roughly 25 new models that are supposed this year. There were supposed to be actually like 30, and some have been canceled. But I think one of the things, and it'd be interesting to see if Stephanie agrees with this, is that I think one of the things that we're seeing right now and might see for another quarter is kind of that Osborne effect, right? Like if you're thinking about buying an EV this year and you're going, oh, but if I wait till Q4 when the Kia EV3 is going to come out, or if I or the Toyota Highlander or the Rivian R2, and Q3 or Q4, there's so many amazing new models coming out. BMW,
Hey Loren, I'm going to have to interrupt. You're
coming out
you've
this
chopped
year.
enough to
Impact you. Yeah.
Hey Loren, sorry, you're choppy enough where you might have to go off camera for a little bit and see what happens. Sorry. And we'll come back to you in a second. There's a couple things that came in through the people participating, and I just want to acknowledge those. One, we intend to get to some of these questions. We are going to talk about some of the used EV market that's out there. And there was a question about sort of what's happening globally. And really this oil price volatility is impacting the European market. It is impacting other markets as well. The stories right now are actually by way of example that China in many ways did a lot to risk mitigate against this oil impact, because they are so far ahead on transportation electrification. And literally in the U.S., if we had gone to being at 25% of the market or more, we would have already inoculated ourselves from a lot of the price shock that we're seeing. And we're talking about potentially on a yearly basis billions of dollars saved in oil and gas. Obviously not for every consumer, but it does start to show up and adds up quickly when we use 20 million barrels of oil a day. So Stephanie, maybe to go back to the earlier thing, in looking at your report and the information that you've shared before, we have a lot of EVs that were leased in the last couple of years, and a lot of those are going to be coming into the market in the next several months. And so what does that mean for the EV market right now and for consumers? But I also think maybe this is important for businesses and fleets that are thinking about electrification with all these leases coming off.
Yeah, I think the used EV market is like the shiny light. It's like, even though it's less like 2.2% share of the overall used market, is the trajectory. And to your point, Ben, since 2023 to 2025, about 1.4 million EVs were leased. And so those are going to start coming off lease. And so this year we're forecasting about 300,000 coming off lease, about 600 2027, and then maybe around 650, 660 in 2028. And so this is going to be able to provide consumers a wide range of EVs at different price points, and it makes it affordable. And I think when you think about the overall value proposition, I know consumers look at what that monthly payment is, but with used EVs, I think it's really like the strong value proposition to say you can buy this used EV at price parity to used gas vehicle, plus you get the lower maintenance, lower cost to charge versus gas. And so you're going to save a lot of money, and you have a lot of vehicle for that price that you're going to get it at. Because EVs, typically most of the depreciation is the first 3 years. And so you're going to get that vehicle when that depreciation starts to slow down and get all the benefits that you get from driving that EV in terms of maintenance and cost from charging.
Yeah, no, it's I think it is this interesting moment where there used to be a sentiment about the early stages of transportation electrification, which was butts in seats. A little crude sounding, but it was the idea that you needed to get people behind the wheel. And I think ownership is even that next sort of big step. And you see it, I see it as a cul-de-sac effect, right? Like once you own one in a neighborhood, people are curious. And it sort of gets rid of this, like, oh, it seems scary or hard or challenging. And I think, in some ways, the political headwinds and the disinformation has led to people sort of questioning, like, how well do EVs work and can I get to where I go? And it leads me, Loren, I'm interested because, range anxiety, as I like to call it, some people call it, or I call it range uncertainty rather, but people call it range anxiety. It still seems to be a top issue that holds EV buyers back. I think that'll still be true for the used market, but are we making any progress? And how are we doing in terms of solving that problem?
Yeah, and apologies to everyone for the video and stuff. Hopefully, I turned off all the cameras, so hopefully you can hear me okay now.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, we're making actually great progress on range. Most of the new EV models coming out have plus or minus 300 miles of range. Many of them 325, 350, even models with 400. So I feel like there's still going to be range anxiety or concern about range for people who are driving pickups and things like that in the Midwest and stuff. But for most people, coast and stuff, 300 miles of range is plenty. So I feel like we're almost there and checking that one off, right? That range concerns are sort of falling by the wayside for a lot of people considering an EV. I think where we've really moved to now is charger anxiety, right? The concern about, are there going to be enough chargers where I go, or even where I live, and are they going to be working and have a good experience? And on that front, Ben, we're making great progress on like the numbers. We had a record last year of roughly 17,000 new fast charger ports. We're actually, in the last 3 years, we're actually deploying more fast chargers from a ratio perspective versus new EV sales, right? So we're actually, in some ways, we're getting ahead of just the sort of the number of charging ports. Where we're still having some issues is on the charging experience, right? People, it's just kind of an unfamiliar process for most drivers, and they pull up and they might find that they need to download a charging app or something, or they don't have the right connector now with NACS, or there's a payment issue, a charger is down, it's full, whatever it is. So that's really the next phase, what I refer to as charging 2.0. So we're building I believe plenty of chargers. There's still some charging deserts, but really the next phase is we've got to improve that charger experience for drivers.
There's an interesting article that came out about, I don't know, 6 months ago or whatever, from the New York Times, and it actually documented how far people are from chargers and where are there potentially quote unquote charging deserts, and that gap is really closed in a big way. I think for people who are out there who haven't driven electric, the thing that you realize is there's way more chargers near you than you really think. So I used to make a joke that we should actually just make fake chargers everywhere, because it's changing the perception about access to charging much more so than it is the realities of access to charging. And that isn't to say there are places where there might be gaps, but it is the gaps have really been closed in a big way over the last several years. And then the other part is the technology on the cars has gotten so much better, and I can speak from personal experience. I've been driving electric for 13 years. It really helps you figure out. It takes the sort of guesswork out of it. And oftentimes, I mean, you can plug in where you're going to go. No pun intended, or pun intended on that one. But you can plug in where you're going to go, and it tells you exactly where the charger should be, how long it'll take to charge, how much the cost projection is. And so it's like the software has started to catch up to the hardware, and I think that's really exciting. But
yeah,
Stephanie, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, one quick thing is just on the sort of the visibility issue, right? Like, excuse me, like you said, we now know in our car where the chargers are, but the problem is all the people that aren't buying EVs, they don't see them, right? Like we know where they are, but and so that's still something that, you know, I think is part of the next phase is, right, just visibility. We need signage, right? The, you know, the non-EV buyers just don't believe that they're there, and so we've got to kind of raise that visibility, like you see in the gas station business, right, where there's, you know, one on every four corners of an intersection.
Yep. Yeah, Stephanie, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I would just add the same. I agree with the visibility and making sure it feels safe, secure. There's amenities and also real-time data, so that when you're put in your app, you're going to this charging station, you know when you get there, it's actually operational, where you are in the queue. So just real-time data, so that you know when you're going to get like results or whatever, have that really good experience. Because I think that's once you have a bad experience and word of mouth, and that's where we start to get this perception that EV charging, you know, it's not reliable. But we've had so many strides in the last year or so. So I think it's education and more visibility, like Loren mentioned.
Yeah, it's I think there's a prime example of BP Pulse. They just did their gigasites, as what they're calling them, but they have one in Los Angeles that they announced, and then they're growing those. And it's interesting because ride-hail drivers are using those, and so the gigasite is basically a charging location that has, you know, 30, 40 DC fast chargers. And the good thing about this is that you can have the sort of way to make those things work from a money perspective by having the gig economy or ride-hail drivers using those. But then it means that there can be more access, like what we're used to from a gas station perspective. And so it's going to be an interesting model to see how that sort of proliferates, and does that also change that perception about access to charging. So, Sevi, you brought up earlier the political headwinds and the challenges that has for the market. And then, you know, Loren, you brought up the idea of, you know, canceled product launches, right? Or canceled products or pullbacks from the auto industry. But Stephanie, I guess for you and Cox, is that something you have any way to really track, the idea of what the impacts of those political headwinds are, and or the idea of the announcements from automakers that could leave people sort of not sure where the future is for their automaker?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely like the tariffs is a good example. We track tariffs and like what the implications, how much additional cost that could potentially be on a vehicle. The manufacturers have mainly absorbed that. But like even when you look at OEMs postponing or, you know, eliminating a product launch of an EV, looking at production. So you're going to get an idea of what that inventory day supply is going to be. Because that's the other thing too. Sometimes when you peel back the onion, you might think that sales are down for a specific model, but it might just be production. There might be a switch over to the new model year. So there's other factors, like even the Aria that's going away. Definitely sales were challenging, but tariffs was another reason why that's being pulled away. So I think there's a lot of different things you have to look at to kind of figure out what's going to be coming down the pipeline in production numbers as well.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's funny because I think in some ways, like the average consumer, that doesn't sort of oftentimes hit how they're thinking about their decision making. It's just they go to the lot, they have an idea of a car that they want, you know, and then it's just a cost factor. And I guess it does bring me to the idea of, though, you know, are we seeing the cost go down? And last time you talked about the average price, and so, you know, I guess I would put it in maybe the average isn't going down, but aren't there some examples of there's a few more like sort of vehicles that hit that cheaper price range and can provide access?
Yeah, I know we're putting out our ATP. I think it goes out today. So, but I guess I'll mention it. So like for the month of March, you know, the average is 54,508. And it actually was the difference between the ICE Plus was the lowest on record, another record. But when you look at the data, Tesla, the Model Y, they decreased their ATP decline by 2.7%. And because it's such huge volume, it drags down the overall average of the transaction price for EVs. Plus, you had more higher volume of like the Equinox and some of those more affordable options. So when you look at that number, you might think, oh, EVs are getting cheaper. It's just there's more to it, right? There's certain models that might have had more of the volume. And like I mentioned, the Model Y, whatever Tesla does, that impacts the overall market just because of their volume.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, obviously they're such a big dominant part of the volume, although we are seeing, you know, moments like the Ioniq 5 that are creating a bit more competition, and
Oh,
so you
yeah.
brought up earlier the Toyota. Loren, I know you often will dig into the individual models to try and sort of think through like sort of what's happening and what does that mean in terms of what the market looks like. And I don't know if you've had anything else that jumped out to you, like the Toyota example, where it was just oh, look at this is happening. There's a growth here, or maybe it's about lack of supply. And you know what, Loren, by the way, try coming off camera or coming back on camera, because your connection seems stable again.
All right, let me try. Fingers crossed. Tell me if it, interrupt me if it doesn't go well, and I'll turn it back off. But yeah, I mean, as we've talked about Toyota, but I think one of the interesting things is we've seen over the last few years is, models like the BZ, the Honda Prologue, the Hyundai Ioniq, and I think even the Chevrolet Equinox, their sales have been actually often really volatile from like one quarter to another, because a lot of the sales has really been driven by incentives, right? Like there was a period there where, the Honda Prologue was, I think, the third or fourth highest selling vehicle a year ago or 18 months ago, because they were just such sweetheart deals. And that's one of the things we're seeing with the BZ right now, right? So part of, and Stephanie mentioned how difficult it is to forecast this year. And part of it is just not knowing how aggressive the automaker is going to be on some of these models, and of course supply. I mean, I'll give you, Ben, a quick example. In Q3 of last year, the end of the tax credit, the Audi Q6 e-tron, which we were one of the people that leased one in September of last year, sold over 10,000 units in Q3. It was crazy high, right? They sold like 100 in Q4. And it was simply because Audi stopped bringing them to the U.S. And I talked to the general manager at the dealer, and he said, yeah, they weren't going to get like either any supply or very low supply for a couple of quarters. So I think that's one of the other like significant variables this year, is just going to be, are these automakers bringing them in from Japan and Germany and things like that? And then the other one is just production hell, right? Like there's all this excitement around the Rivian R2 and many of these other models, but as we've seen, a lot of these models run into supply chain issues or production issues and stuff, and the volume you think you were going to get in a quarter takes another 1 or 2 quarters to actually get up to where you had expected it to be.
Yeah, and Stephanie, when you were talking earlier, ATP, I assume means annual transaction price.
Yeah, average transaction price.
Oh, average transaction, so not annual, of course, not annual.
Yep. Average
transaction price. Okay. Are there tell me the size of the used market, or tell everyone here, what's the difference between on average the number of used EVs or number of used vehicles rather that are bought on an annual basis versus new vehicles?
So if you look at like this, so for used EVs, it's a record quarter. It was over 100,000. So it's less. It's probably going to, maybe it could get to 500,000 for 2026, but it's like 2% of the overall used market. So it's huge. Like that's why I think the used EV market's going to be a great story as we start to get more and more vehicles available, and the access point for everyone. I think it just provides more equity around access to EVs, and so I think there's a lot more volume that's going to be compared to the new. And then also the models that you see in the used, it follows in the used follow the new. So whatever sells well in the new, you start to see that in the used. So Model Y, Model 3, the Mach-E, the Bolt, the Leaf.
Or the Q6 e-tron, a good example of if people did purchase 10,000 units, those are coming off lease or owned short term. That's another good example of coming into the used market. When I've looked in the past, for those who aren't aware, it's like the used market has a tendency to be somewhere around 40 million purchases on an annual basis, and then the new car market tends to be somewhere between 13 and 17 million. So it's like there's it's a 4x,
like 2.5 times.
Or I guess, yes, bad math, 2.5, 3 times the new car. I do think that that's going to be an interesting question as we get more used EVs, right? That actually does really, it might actually also help the new EV market And I'm curious, Stephanie, just to come back to you again for a second, but are we seeing anything happen around the residual value, which for people who don't know what that means, it's like, what's the value of the car after it's been leased or used? And so it helps determine like what's its market value in the used sector. And are we seeing anything change there?
Yeah, I think over time it's going to get better. I mean, I definitely think the EVs depreciated more than ICE, right, initially. But as we start to get this influx of more EVs, and I think the other thing too, like longer term, knowing that that battery health, which is, battery is about 40% of the vehicle cost, and knowing that that battery is going to stay in good health, doesn't degrade as fast as people thought it would be, I think that's going to over time help to keep the value of that EV. I think so. I think that's going to be, and that's another educational piece, which I think is important as we see more volume in the used marketplace, that consumers are educated on that battery health. So there's not that barrier that they're worried that battery's going to die or they're going to have to spend thousands of dollars to replace it. So I think that's going to be important to watch.
But by the
Ben,
way, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna, disagree with something you said. I think, the used EV market may be one of the biggest headwinds and hurdles against, new models this year, right? I mean, if you go down to a Tesla showroom and Model Y is, 45, $50,000 or whatever, but then you can get, a 3-year-old one for between 25 to 30, right? Like, you might opt for the used one. So I think, we haven't talked a lot about this, but I think sort of the used market could actually be one of the biggest competitors to growth in new EV sales going forward.
I guess it's not that you're disagreeing with me. I don't know that I don't disagree with the statement. I think it's a question of, are those, is a new car buyer still a new car buyer? And so that's really what's happening, is it's the people who are buying the new car are still going to do that. And that's a question, because I don't know that we really know for sure what the trend is. Are these people who always buy new cars, always lease new cars, and have the capacity to do so? And is that it, or is it something where you're right, as you're saying, there is more competition because there's used EVs, and so it means people will be making a choice between a new EV or a used EV. And I think it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. My hope, though, and view is it does create more access to people for people right now who maybe see EVs as being too far away financially.
Yep.
And frankly, it potentially drives up the cost of a used EV because it is a good value. And if there's more interest and more demand, right? Like, that's just the simple sort of nature of this. So I do think it's going to be one of the big stories. And the question is it a good story from a market perspective, or does it actually create more questions in the market? So Stephanie, when you guys are looking at the, like, one of the questions people might have is, oh, if I'm thinking about a used EV, though, like, oh, the battery, is that a big problem? And you all have a program to sort of monitor battery health. And so just remind people, like, what are we seeing so far on battery health?
Yeah, so we have, it's called Manheim Auctions, and that's a used vehicle, basically, where used vehicles are bought and sold. And so a lot of EVs are starting to go through that auction house, and we have a way of scoring the health of that battery, so state of health. And the EVs that are going through are 90 plus. I mean, depending, even better, like if it's an earlier year. And so just proof point that the battery is in good health. And those EVs that go through our auction that are listed on our Auto Trader site actually have that score on the listing on Auto Trader. And I think that just provides more trust and transparency, which is needed around used EVs. And so I think that's something, and we'll continue to get more and more volume. And I think over time, like with ICE, it's all about gas or mileage. And so I think with EVs, as we get more and more data and battery health, we'll start to see different, maybe differentiate by makes or where people live, or depending, different factors. But I think that's going to be so important for consumers. And with Ben, you're aware of this, with the California, with the CARB, which that was revoked, but that was one of the pieces of it, was to have OEMs put the state of health on the dashboard. But because that was revoked, there's no movement on that. But I think that's something that we just need to have standardization and visibility of the state of health of the EV, of the battery.
Loren, when you're thinking about the idea of the the feedback on charging infrastructure, and you talked about the access, but then reliability being still a need and maybe a challenge. Are there any examples where you're seeing it work well, and or where we're starting to see that improvement? Because I think it's helpful for people to understand, are we moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's happening is that old statement, which I'll get wrong, is right, like all boats rise in the harbor or whatever. But the fact that I think I'm going to probably get this wrong, but I think it's something like 60% of the new fast charger ports that have been deployed has been in the last 3 years, right? Like I mentioned, we did 17,000 last year. So one of the things that's happening is like the major new charging networks. We've got Walmart coming in. You've got, as you mentioned, people like BP Pulse and Mercedes-Benz and Ion, the car maker You've got all these sort of major companies coming into the charging space, and many of them are sort of starting from scratch. So all the hardware is brand new. Most of it is 350, 400 kW. For those that don't know, that's basically like at the top end of the high power chargers that means you can charge significantly faster. So that is bringing up reliability. It's bringing up power, faster charging curves. So I think, and the other thing that's part of that, Ben, is that all these companies that I mentioned, most of them are deploying stations with 8 to 10 or 12. In the case of Tesla, about 20 oftentimes stalls per station. Many of them have amenities and canopies and stuff. Yeah. So the overall experience is improving dramatically and will going forward, primarily because of all these sort of new players that are entering the market and sort of raising it up. And so the challenge really comes for sort of poor experiences and unsafe, like Stephanie mentioned, is those sort of older stations that you'll see and stuff. And on the other thing that's sort of interesting is we're starting to see AI come into the market, right? So there's some companies out there that have like AI chat and voice systems. So if you pull up the charger and you plug in and it doesn't work, you can just chat with an AI agent that'll help you, figure out how to solve your sort of charging problems. So there's a lot of things happening in the support and kind of other spaces to really improve that charger experience. And hopefully plug and charge will continue to be deployed in all the major new EVs coming out, making that simple plug in, walk away, Tesla-like experience.
So, okay, we are amazingly at time. It goes so fast. I think what we're learning here is 45 minutes isn't enough. So maybe we're going to have to make this an hour. Loren, we're going to have to buy you a better internet access for Christmas, though, or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try to go to wired.
But it happens to all of us, though. It's like a weird thing where it's just like it's fine, and then when you need it most, it suddenly isn't. But maybe as a bit of a wrap up, and sorry to extend it long here for a second. We've talked a lot about trends. We've talked about the idea of higher to some results from Q1. We've talked about still a lot of political headwinds, big question marks about what does the used EV market mean? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Maybe it's a little bit of both. The idea of charging reliability, whether or not batteries are going to actually, last a long time. I think the general trend is they're lasting longer than anyone would have thought, and they're performing better, but still lots to determine. But we're just past the first quarter in 26. What's one reason you're optimistic about what 26 looks like for EVs? So we'll do reverse this time. So Loren, what's one reason that you're optimistic about what the future holds for EVs in 26?
I think all the new models that are coming out, right? The sort of 25-ish new models that are coming out. Most of them are Gen 2 and Gen 3 from the automakers, and so they're really, really, really competitive. In the past, a lot of them had fallen short in everything from software to range and stuff. So I think that's the thing, is just that there's going to be amazing choice for consumers, especially as we get into like Q3 and Q4.
Stephanie, what do you think?
I would what Lauren just said about the models, I think that's a great, like, it's just more things to choose from. But also, I think the infrastructure continuing to grow and become more reliable, accessible, equitable, I think that's going to continue to evolve. And so I think I'm looking forward to that. And I also think even though we've seen postponement and delays on products, the OEMs are committed. They're on different timelines, but they're committed. And we'll start to see this year kind of who starts to lead and who falls behind. Q1's a start to that, but we'll see where we end up in Q4.
For me, and because I want to answer this question as well, I think that we saw this drop, the sort of bottom drop out of federal policy, right? And that was just the big thing where all of a sudden it was this rocket ship that was potentially ready to take off, like Artemis 2, and go around the moon. And then the bottom dropped. But states aren't just like hanging out and waiting. States are reacting. Cities are reacting. There's a question that came in earlier about fleets. Fleets are reacting. The value proposition for fleets is still incredibly strong. And in many ways, the value proposition has only grown because of oil volatility and the price of gasoline. And so my hope is it brings yet another sort of microscope, whatever the tension about why it's so important to diversify how we power our transportation sector. Because the more that we have options, the more we've de-risked ourselves from that roller coaster of peaks and valleys and what that means for consumers. So thank you both so much for being here. We, as always, did a terrible job. It's my fault of getting to all the questions. So we'll look to probably extend this the next quarter. If you're looking for Cox's market insights, you can find them on their website. If you're looking for more about Loren and Chargeonomics and some of the data that he tracks on a regular basis, I think it's best to find him on LinkedIn, but I'm sure there's other places as well. And Loren, you'll be invited back. So I think let's look forward to next quarter. You passed the test. Just kidding. But we'll look forward to next
Except
quarter.
Except for the internet test.
Well, we'll just hopefully that's better. But we'll look forward to next quarter. And for those of you who are on, please share with your friends. Tell them to join next time. And I think hopefully we can provide some good insights into what's happening in the EV market. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
And have a great rest of the week.
Have a good day.